When my fiancée changed our prenup without telling me, I had to end it all. Imagine this: you're about to marry the love of your life, someone you've shared everything with, someone you trust completely. You're just weeks away from the wedding, feeling secure about the life you're about to build together. And then, you find out that the person you thought you knew has been keeping something huge from you. This isn't a small secret, it's a massive betrayal. And you're left wondering, who have I been in love with all this time? That's exactly what happened to Leo, a 34-year-old tech entrepreneur who's built his life and his business from the ground up. He worked day and night to create something that, for him, wasn't just about money. It's about his passion, his drive, his entire life's work. And now, after more than a decade of relentless effort, he's finally got something big. Sure, he's in love with Sarah, but he's not naive. He knows protecting his life's work is crucial. So Leo and Sarah agreed to a prenuptial agreement. It was fair. Leo made sure Sarah would be financially secure, no matter what happened. They both agreed, signed it, and that was supposed to be that. But then, one evening, Leo's going through some paperwork, just double-checking everything before the big day, and that's when he sees it. Right there, in black and white, the terms have changed. The prenup has been edited. If they ever get divorced, Sarah would get half of his company, his investments, and even lifetime alimony. Leo's eyes freeze on the page. He can't believe what he's reading. He starts flipping back and forth, trying to figure out if he's reading it wrong, but it's right there, plain as day. The prenup they agreed to isn't the prenup in his hands. Leo's heart sinks. He thought he and Sarah were on the same page, that they both understood the importance of protecting what he built. But here he is, staring at a document that tells a different story, one that Sarah clearly rewrote behind his back. And then, a flood of questions starts racing through his mind. How could she do this without talking to him? Why would she need half of everything he's worked for, especially when they had agreed on something fair? What else had she been hiding from him? And most importantly, does he even know the person he's about to marry? Leo's about to make a choice that could change his life forever, but he can't shake the feeling that he's looking at a version of Sarah he never wanted to see. Stay tuned, because what Leo discovers next will make him question everything about their relationship, and the decisions he makes in the coming days will test his limits in ways he never expected. Background on Leo and Sarah's relationship. Leo had always been a driven guy. From a young age he knew he wanted to make something of himself, something big. He wasn't born into wealth. In fact, his family had struggled financially when he was growing up. He watched his parents work long hours, barely making ends meet, and something about that just sparked this fire inside him. He wanted to break that cycle, to create a life where money wasn't something to worry about every day. When Leo was in college, he became obsessed with technology. It was right around the time when apps were blowing up, and everyone was talking about the next big thing. He'd spend hours coding in his dorm room, skipping parties and social events just to get closer to his dream. He believed that if he could create something valuable enough, he could change his life, and maybe even change the world. And he wasn't wrong. Fast forward a decade, and Leo's now the founder of a successful tech company, one he built from scratch. This isn't just a job for him, it's his life's work. And then he met Sarah. They met at a tech conference in San Francisco. She wasn't in the tech world, she was working part-time in retail, but she was there with a friend, just tagging along. Leo remembers seeing her across the room and feeling instantly drawn to her. She was fun, easygoing, and had this sense of adventure that he found refreshing. Leo was used to the high-stress, intense environment of the tech industry, so meeting someone who could make him laugh and relax was a welcome change. They hit it off right away, and before he knew it, they were inseparable. Sarah quickly became part of his life. She'd accompany him on business trips, they'd dine at some of the best restaurants in the city, and she seemed genuinely interested in his work. Leo liked that she wasn't in tech because it gave him a break from his world. With Sarah he could escape the stress and enjoy a little bit of normalcy. Plus, she had a carefree vibe that made everything seem a little lighter, a little easier. Leo felt lucky to have her by his side. Over time though, there were subtle hints about money. At first it was just small comments, a joke about how Leo was the rich one or a laugh about how nice it would be if he bought her a luxury handbag. He didn't think much of it then, he assumed it was lighthearted, just part of her personality. But as their relationship grew, so did her interest in the lifestyle his money provided. She enjoyed the luxury hotels, the fine dining, and the designer clothes. And while Leo didn't mind spoiling her, he sometimes wondered if she appreciated him for who he was or for what he could give her. As they got more serious, Leo began thinking about their future. He could see himself spending the rest of his life with Sarah, but he couldn't ignore the importance of protecting the life he'd worked so hard to build. It wasn't just about money, it was about everything he'd sacrificed, all the late nights, the missed moments with friends and family, the risks he'd taken. He wanted to make sure that no matter what happened, the company he'd built, and the legacy he hoped to leave behind, would be safe. When he brought up the idea of a prenuptial agreement, he was nervous. He wasn't sure how Sarah would react. But to his relief she seemed to understand. She nodded, said she trusted him, and agreed that it was a reasonable thing to do. Leo was clear that he wanted her to be comfortable and secure, and the prenup would reflect that. He didn't want her to worry about money if things ever went south. But he also made it clear that his company and his investments weren't up for discussion. This was his work, his life, and he needed to protect it. In those conversations, Sarah agreed. She told him she understood, that it was smart, and that she was okay with it. Leo felt reassured. He thought they were on the same page, that she valued him for who he was and respected his desire to protect what he'd built. They worked with a lawyer, went through the details, and Leo made sure it was fair. Sarah would be secure financially, but the heart of his work, his company, would stay with him. They signed the prenup, and it felt like a weight lifted off his shoulders. He could finally focus on the wedding, on building a future with Sarah. For a while, everything felt perfect. They were making wedding plans, and Leo was genuinely excited about the life they were building. He trusted Sarah, and she seemed to trust him. But in the back of his mind, there was always this tiny, nagging feeling, a small doubt he could never fully explain. Sometimes he'd catch her making remarks about their future wealth or hinting at luxury items she'd love to have, and while he'd laugh it off, there was a part of him that wondered if they saw money the same way. Leo grew up knowing the value of every dollar, and he'd been careful with his money his entire life. Sarah, though, seemed to see his success as a pathway to a lavish life, a gateway to things she'd never had before. Leo told himself he was overthinking. He wanted to believe she was with him for all the right reasons, and after all, they'd agreed on the prenup. Everything was set. But little did he know, things were about to take a turn he never saw coming. Prenup agreement and initial agreement. As their relationship grew more serious, Leo started thinking about the practical side of things. He was head over heels for Sarah, and wanted to build a life with her, but he also knew he couldn't ignore the importance of protecting the business he'd built from the ground up. For Leo, this wasn't about being selfish or stingy. It was about safeguarding years of blood, sweat, and tears, every late night, every sacrifice he'd made to get where he was. Leo's success wasn't accidental. He'd worked tirelessly to create something he could be proud of. To him, the prenup wasn't about doubting Sarah's love or planning for the worst. It was about ensuring that his life's work would remain intact, no matter what happened. Leo knew he wanted to share his life with Sarah, but he also needed to secure his company, his investments, and his financial stability. This wasn't just money to him, it was his legacy, his mark on the world. When he brought up the idea of a prenuptial agreement to Sarah, he took a deep breath, unsure of her reaction. He knew the topic could be sensitive, but he also hoped she'd understand where he was coming from. He sat her down one evening, explaining his thoughts in the clearest way he could. He reassured her that this wasn't about distrust or setting limits, it was simply about being responsible. Sarah listened quietly as Leo spoke. To his relief, she seemed to understand. She didn't get defensive or upset. Instead, she nodded, saying she trusted him, and that she understood why he felt the need to protect what he'd worked so hard for. Leo was relieved. He thought they were on the same page, and that she respected his desire to keep his business safe. She even told him that the prenup was a smart move, and that she admired him for thinking things through. Leo felt reassured, even a bit proud. He thought it showed that Sarah valued him for who he was and respected the work he'd put in. They agreed to set up a meeting with a lawyer to draft the agreement. Leo wanted the prenup to be fair. His main goal was to ensure that his company and investments would stay protected, but he also made sure Sarah would be financially secure if things didn't work out. He wanted her to feel safe, to know that he wasn't leaving her with nothing. The agreement they came up with was clear and straightforward. If the marriage ended, Leo's business assets and investments would remain his. However, Sarah would be entitled to a reasonable settlement that would allow her to continue her lifestyle and be financially stable. They reviewed the details line by line, ensuring that it felt fair and balanced. Leo even went over the terms with her, explaining why he'd chosen each point, making sure she felt comfortable. Sarah's response during those conversations was reassuring. She didn't ask for more or push back against any of the terms. She simply agreed, nodding as Leo walked her through the details. She said she understood, and Leo believed her. He thought this was a sign of mutual respect, that they both understood the importance of what he was protecting. With her approval, they finalized the prenup with their lawyer and signed it. For Leo, signing the prenup felt like a huge weight lifted off his shoulders. He could finally look forward to their future together, without worrying about what might happen to his business if things ever went wrong. He'd protected his work, ensured Sarah would be secure, and felt like they'd made a mature, responsible decision together. He was excited to move forward, planning the wedding and focusing on the life they were building. In the weeks that followed, everything seemed perfect. They were planning their wedding, and discussing their future, and Leo was genuinely happy. He trusted Sarah, and he thought she trusted him. But in the back of his mind, he sometimes thought about her occasional remarks, small comments about their future wealth, or how she'd love certain luxuries. While he didn't think too much of them, they occasionally made him wonder if they saw finances the same way. Still, Leo brushed it off, telling himself that everyone sees money differently, and that didn't mean anything was wrong. As far as he was concerned, the prenup was a sign of their mutual understanding. It was a commitment to their future, and to Leo, it showed that they respected each other's boundaries. He was happy with the agreement, believing that Sarah genuinely valued him for who he was and understood the importance of his work. They'd gone over everything, reviewed the terms together, and signed it. Everything was set. But sometimes, life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. Little did Leo know, the prenup he'd worked so hard to create, the one he thought had sealed their future and protected his life's work, was about to be changed in a way he never saw coming. Inciting incident: discovery of altered prenup. A few weeks before the wedding, Leo decided to look over some of their legal paperwork one last time, just to make sure everything was in order. It was supposed to be a simple task, a quick review before he could focus entirely on their big day. But what Leo found on that evening was something he never expected, something that would change everything. As he flipped through the pages of their prenuptial agreement, Leo noticed some odd changes in the document. At first, he thought it might be a mistake, or a draft he hadn't reviewed properly. But as he looked closer, the changes were clear, and they were big. In this new version, Sarah would be entitled to half of his company, a large chunk of his investments, and even lifetime alimony if they ever got divorced. Leo's heart began to race. His eyes scanned the pages, almost hoping he was reading it wrong, but the words stayed the same. This wasn't the prenup he and Sarah had agreed to. A sinking feeling crept over him as he realized the magnitude of what had happened. Someone had altered the prenup, and Leo knew it wasn't him. The terms they'd spent so much time agreeing on, the boundaries they'd set to protect his life's work, were now completely different. Sarah hadn't mentioned anything about changing the prenup, and this wasn't a minor adjustment. These were massive changes, ones that would entitle her to things they'd specifically agreed to leave out. Leo tried to stay calm, but he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. How could this have happened? They'd gone over every single detail together, and she'd assured him she understood. They'd even signed the final version, sealing their mutual respect and understanding. Now, looking at this altered document, Leo felt like he was staring at a completely different agreement. It was like someone had taken the life he'd worked so hard to build and rewritten it without his consent. Questions began racing through his mind, each one sharper and more painful than the last. Did Sarah think she could just sneak these changes past him? Why hadn't she talked to him if she wanted different terms? And most importantly, how could she even think this was okay? Leo had trusted her, and in that trust he'd assumed she respected his hard work and everything he'd built. Now it felt like all that trust was being shattered, piece by piece. Leo tried to think of an explanation that didn't involve betrayal. Maybe she'd been advised by someone else, or maybe there was some misunderstanding. But deep down, he knew that changing a legal document like this wasn't a simple mistake. This was deliberate. He felt a mixture of shock, hurt, and anger. The woman he loved, the person he'd been so excited to marry, had done something behind his back that felt like a total betrayal. He sat there, staring at the document, feeling an emptiness growing inside him. This wasn't just about money or legal terms. This was about trust, about values, and about what kind of relationship they really had. How could he marry someone who could do something like this? He thought back to all the conversations they'd had about the prenup, the moments when she'd reassured him that she understood his need to protect what he'd built. All those moments felt empty now, almost like they'd been part of some act to make him feel safe. Leo knew he had to confront Sarah, but he wasn't sure what he would say. He wasn't even sure what he wanted to hear from her. Did she expect him to be okay with this? Did she think he wouldn't notice? Or did she believe that, once they were married, he would just have to go along with it? The more he thought about it, the more he felt a sense of disbelief and heartbreak. This was a side of Sarah he had never imagined. As he prepared himself to confront her, Leo tried to think through his emotions. He'd always prided himself on being rational, on handling things with a level head. But right now, his thoughts were a storm of betrayal, anger, and sadness. This wasn't how he imagined things would go. He thought they were partners, that they respected each other's boundaries and dreams. But now, he wasn't so sure if she even saw him or just the life he could provide her. At that moment, Leo realized something painful. This wasn't just a mistake or a misunderstanding, it was a wake-up call. If Sarah was willing to change something as important as their prenuptial agreement without even telling him, what else was she capable of hiding? What other lines was she willing to cross? As he stared down at the altered document, Leo felt a wave of clarity washing over him. This was no longer just about a prenup. It was about trust, respect, and everything he'd thought their relationship was built on. And in that moment, Leo knew that the life he'd envisioned with Sarah might be slipping away. The confrontation he was about to have with her could change everything. Our initial confrontation. With the altered prenuptial agreement in hand, Leo knew he couldn't ignore this. He had to talk to Sarah, even though he wasn't sure how he would bring it up or what he wanted her to say. All he knew was that he needed answers. He spent the night tossing and turning, trying to process everything he'd just discovered. By morning he was exhausted but determined. This was too important to brush aside. That evening, as Sarah came home, Leo decided it was time. He called her into the living room, his heart pounding as he prepared himself for the conversation. She walked in, sensing his serious expression, and immediately asked if something was wrong. Leo took a deep breath and held up the prenup, looking straight at her. "Sarah," he began, his voice steady but firm, "I found something in the prenup, and I need you to explain it to me. It's not the agreement we both signed. There are major changes, and I need to know why you did this without telling me." For a moment Sarah seemed taken aback. She looked at the document in his hand, her eyes widening slightly. But then, to Leo's surprise, she shrugged and gave him a small smile. "Oh, that," she said, as if it were nothing important. "I didn't think you'd mind. I just made a few adjustments, extra protection, you know. I thought you'd be fine with it." Leo stared at her, feeling a mix of disbelief and hurt. He couldn't believe how casually she was responding, as if this wasn't a huge breach of trust. He took a moment to process her words, trying to keep his emotions in check. You thought I'd be fine with it, he repeated, his voice barely hiding his frustration. Sarah, these aren't small changes. This new version gives you half of everything I've worked for my company, my investments, even lifetime alimony. That's not what we agreed on. Sarah waved her hand dismissively, brushing off his concerns. Leo, come on. We're getting married. Isn't everything supposed to be shared? I mean, I've been there for you, supporting you all this time. I thought you'd want me to feel secure too. Leo felt his stomach sink. Supporting me, he asked, almost in disbelief. Sarah, I've built this company over years of hard work and sacrifice. You joined my life recently. We talked about this. We agreed on terms that were fair, terms that would still give you financial security if things ever went wrong. Sarah rolled her eyes, a hint of irritation crossing her face. Leo, it's just a piece of paper. It doesn't change anything between us. And I don't see why you're getting so upset. I thought this would make me feel more secure, like we're really in this together. Leo felt his anger building, but more than that, he felt a deep sadness. He thought Sarah understood him, that she valued his work and respected his boundaries. But now it seemed like she saw his achievements as something to claim, as if being in a relationship entitled her to everything he'd worked for. I'm upset, he replied, keeping his voice steady, because you changed something incredibly important behind my back. You didn't talk to me, you didn't ask me, you just assumed I'd go along with it. Sarah crossed her arms, clearly annoyed. Leo, you're making this a bigger deal than it needs to be. I sacrificed a lot for this relationship too, you know. I quit my job so I could travel with you on your business trips, and I could support you. That's a lot to give up. Leo looked at her, stunned. In his mind, those sacrifices were more about luxury and lifestyle than actual hardship. They'd stayed in top hotels, dined at fine restaurants, and traveled in style. To him, it didn't feel like she'd given up much, in fact. It felt like she'd gained a lot by being with him.
Sarah,
he said, his voice filled with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. I never asked you to quit your job. I never expected you to give up anything. If you wanted to keep working, I would have supported that. But we're talking about something much bigger here. You changed our entire agreement without even mentioning it to me. She looked away, her expression shifting. I thought you'd understand. I mean, don't you love me? Don't you want me to feel secure? To feel like I'm a real part of your life? Leo felt his heart breaking as he listened to her. He loved her, but he couldn't ignore what this was showing him. It wasn't about love or commitment, it was about control, about entitlement, and about what she felt she was owed simply for being with him. He took a deep breath, struggling to keep his emotions from spilling over. I do love you, Sarah, but this isn't about love. This is about trust and respect. I thought we had a mutual understanding. I thought you valued me for who I am, not just for what I can provide. Sarah looked back at him, a hint of defensiveness in her eyes. You're acting like I'm some kind of gold digger, Leo. I'm just trying to make sure I'm taken care of. Is that so wrong? Leo felt a sharp pang of sadness mixed with disappointment. Sarah, this isn't about accusing you of anything. It's about honesty. If you wanted something different, you could have talked to me. But you didn't. You made these changes behind my back. That's what hurts. There was a long silence between them. Sarah looked away, her expression hardening. I thought you'd understand. I thought you'd be okay with it. I didn't think it would be such a big deal. Leo stood there, feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and betrayal. This wasn't the Sarah he thought he knew. The woman standing before him seemed to have a very different idea of what their relationship meant, and what their future looked like. And in that moment, Leo realized that this wasn't just about a legal document, or a disagreement. It was about two completely different views on trust, respect, and commitment. He looked at her one last time, feeling the weight of his decision settling over him. I need some time to think about this, he said quietly. I need to figure out what all of this really means. Without waiting for a response, Leo turned and walked away, leaving Sarah standing alone. And as he walked away, he knew that everything he'd thought he wanted, the life he'd imagined with her, was now uncertain, and the path forward was anything but clear. Rising conflict, reflection on values. After his conversation with Sarah, Leo felt a deep sadness mixed with frustration. He'd spent years believing that what they had was genuine, that they shared common values, and that they respected each other's boundaries. But now he wasn't so sure. The way she had dismissed his concerns, the entitlement in her words, it all painted a picture he didn't want to see. As he sat alone in his apartment, Leo's mind started to replay their relationship, scene by scene, looking for moments he might have overlooked. He wanted to believe that this was just a misunderstanding, that somehow he could make sense of it all. But the more he thought about it, the clearer things became. There had been small signs along the way, moments that hinted at this side of her. But he'd brushed them off, too caught up in his feelings to take a closer look. One memory stood out in his mind. He remembered an evening not too long ago when they'd gone out with some of his close friends. They'd been celebrating a business milestone, and Leo had ordered a bottle of champagne for the table. As they were toasting, Sarah had made a joking comment about how lucky his friends were to have such a wealthy friend. At the time, he'd laughed it off, assuming she was just being playful. But now, that comment echoed in his mind with a different meaning. Was she more focused on his financial success than he'd realized? There was also the way she'd reacted whenever he mentioned the costs of things, like when he suggested a simpler wedding or a smaller guest list. She would wave it off, saying things like, "Oh, Leo, you can afford it," or "You can afford it," or "You deserve the best, so why not?" He thought she was just trying to make him feel good, encouraging him to enjoy his success. But now, he wondered if she was simply pushing for a life she wanted, using his money as her ticket. The more he thought about it, the more these moments piled up. It was as if he'd been putting together a puzzle, and now, for the first time, he could see the full picture. And that picture didn't look like love or partnership. It looked like entitlement, like someone who saw his achievements as hers to share without question. Leo felt a pang of guilt. He'd ignored these small red flags because he wanted to believe in their love. He wanted to believe that they shared the same values and the same vision for their future. But now, he was questioning everything. Had he been too quick to assume that love was enough? Had he let himself believe that their differences didn't matter? He knew he valued hard work, self-reliance, and the importance of earning one's way. He'd spent years building his company, sacrificing time, energy, and personal life to create something meaningful. And he'd always imagined sharing his life with someone who understood that, who respected his journey. But Sarah's recent actions made him feel like she was looking at his success as something to claim, rather than something to respect. As he tried to make sense of his feelings, Leo began to see that this wasn't just about the prenup. It was about two people with very different ideas of what love and partnership meant. For Leo, love was about respect, trust, and mutual support. It was about building a life together, not simply sharing the spoils of one person's hard work. However, Sarah's behavior suggested that she saw things differently. At that moment, Leo realized how much he'd compromised. He'd overlooked small things, dismissed his own concerns, and put aside his instincts because he wanted their relationship to work. But now he was beginning to understand that real love couldn't thrive on compromises alone, especially when it came to core values. If they couldn't agree on something as fundamental as financial boundaries, how could they build a future together? He tried to put himself in her shoes, to understand why she might have felt the need to change the prenup. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than just security. It felt like a demand for ownership, as if she believed she deserved half of what he'd built simply because she was in his life. That didn't sit well with him. He couldn't imagine asking someone to share half of what they'd worked for without putting in the same effort. Leo's thoughts turned to the values he held dear: honesty, integrity, and the importance of earning one's place. These weren't just abstract ideas to him, they were the foundation of everything he'd built. He realized that he wanted a partner who shared those values, someone who saw the world in a similar way. And now, he wasn't sure if Sarah was that person. As the hours passed, Leo felt his sadness start to shift into a sense of resolve. He knew he couldn't ignore what had happened. He couldn't pretend that this was just a bump in the road. This was a fundamental difference in how they viewed each other, and their future. And that difference was too big to overlook. In that quiet moment, Leo made a decision. He would talk to Sarah one more time, to give her a chance to explain herself fully. He wanted to be fair, to make sure he wasn't acting out of anger or hurt. But he also knew that he couldn't compromise on his values, not when they were the very foundation of who he was. If she couldn't understand that, then he would have to make a painful choice. Leo knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that he deserved a partner who valued him for who he was, not just for what he could give. And in that realization, he found a new sense of strength. He wasn't just protecting his assets, he was protecting his self-worth, his hard work, and everything he'd spent years building. And that, he knew, was something worth standing up for. Backlash from family and friends. As Leo took a few days to think things over, he found himself wanting space, and time to sort through the emotions he was feeling. He wasn't ready to face Sarah again just yet, and he knew he needed to be sure of what he wanted before talking to her. What he didn't expect, though, was for her to reach out to his family and friends, sharing her side of the story before he even had a chance to process it himself. It started with a phone call from his mother. Leo answered, expecting a quick, light-hearted chat, but his mom's voice was tense. "Leo, I just got a call from Sarah," she began, her voice filled with concern. She sounded so upset. "She told me that you're making her feel insecure, and that you're putting the prenup above your relationship." "Leo, what's going on?" Leo took a deep breath, his mind reeling. He hadn't expected Sarah to involve his family. "Mom, there's a lot more to the story," he replied carefully. "We agreed on a prenup together, but she went behind my back and changed it without telling me. It's not about me putting the prenup above our relationship, it's about trust." His mom was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "I just don't understand why she felt she had to change it," she said softly. "Or maybe she just wanted to feel secure. Marriage is a big commitment, Leo." Leo could sense his mom was struggling to balance her sympathy for Sarah with her loyalty to him. But he knew that if Sarah had called his mom, she'd likely reached out to others too. And sure enough, over the next few days he started hearing from more family members and even a couple of his close friends. Each conversation carried a similar tone of concern, with questions about why he wasn't being fair or why he was making Sarah feel left out. It hurt Leo deeply to hear these things. He'd always tried to be fair, to consider others' feelings, and he genuinely believed that he and Sarah had agreed on something balanced. Now, it felt like she was turning everyone against him, painting him as someone who only cared about money. The more he heard from others, the more isolated he felt, as if he were somehow the villain in his own story. One of his close friends, Mark, reached out and didn't hold back. "Leo, man, I heard about the prenup situation. Are you sure you're not overreacting? Sarah's just trying to make sure she's secure, right? I mean, you're in this together." Leo felt a pang of frustration. Mark had always been a loyal friend, someone he trusted, but now he was buying into Sarah's version of the story. "Mark, you know me," Leo replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm not someone who would leave her with nothing. I made sure the prenup was fair, but she changed it behind my back. That's the issue." Mark was quiet for a moment. "I get it, but Sarah just seemed so hurt when she talked about it. She made it sound like you didn't trust her." Leo felt his chest tighten. This was the exact opposite of what he wanted. He'd tried to be fair to ensure they both felt secure, but Sarah's actions were twisting his intentions. It was as if she'd taken his genuine efforts to protect what he'd built and turned them into something ugly, something selfish. Over the next week, the tension continued to grow. Friends who usually joked with him were suddenly distant, and family members he'd always trusted were now questioning his intentions. Every conversation left him feeling more isolated, as if he were in a corner with no way out. He tried to protect his work and his relationship, but now it felt like he was losing both. His sister, Emily, finally called him, her voice full of frustration. "Leo, I love you, but what's going on with Sarah? She told me you're shutting her out, that you're obsessed with keeping your money safe. I just don't understand. Aren't relationships supposed to be about trust?" Leo clenched his jaw, feeling a mix of anger and hurt. "Emily, I do trust her. Or at least I thought I did. But she went behind my back and changed something as important as our prenup without saying a word. It's not about the money, it's about respect and honesty." Emily was silent for a moment, then sighed. "I hear you, Leo, I do. But Sarah sounded so broken up about it. She made it seem like you were ready to throw everything away over a contract. I just want you to be happy." Leo felt his frustration boil over. "Emily, do you think I'd ever hurt her like that on purpose? I've always tried to do right by her. But how can I ignore something like this? How can I build a life with someone who doesn't respect my boundaries?" Their conversation ended on an uncertain note, with Emily promising to think about it but still sounding conflicted. Leo couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing everyone's support, piece by piece. He thought that being open with Sarah, setting fair terms, and building a foundation based on trust would be enough. But now, it seemed like everything he'd done was being used against him. In the days that followed, Leo started to feel more alone than ever. The people he'd counted on, the family and friends who had always been there, now saw him through Sarah's distorted lens. And the weight of that isolation pressed down on him, making him question if he'd done the right thing at all. Was he really being too harsh? Was he letting his need to protect what he'd built drive a wedge between him and the people he loved? But as he sat alone, reflecting on everything, a small voice inside reminded him of the truth. He wasn't being unreasonable, he was standing up for his values. Sarah's actions, her decision to go behind his back, had broken something fundamental between them. And while it hurt deeply to lose the support of his loved ones, he knew that he couldn't compromise on this. If he did, he'd lose a part of himself. Leo realized that this situation had revealed something painful but necessary. It had shown him who he could trust, and who truly understood him. And while it was painful to feel isolated, he knew that standing alone was better than living a life built on lies. Financial exploitation and realization. With the initial backlash from his family and friends, Leo felt a deep sense of isolation, as if he'd been left on his own to make sense of everything. The tension between him and Sarah was thick, and he noticed that she was acting colder, more distant. Their conversations became strained, and Leo found himself wondering how they'd gotten here, how a relationship he once cherished had turned into something so complicated and hurtful. One morning, as he was reviewing his credit card statements, Leo's eyes fell on a charge that he didn't recognize. It was a substantial amount from a luxury boutique he'd never been to. At first he thought it might be a mistake. But as he scrolled through his statement, he saw more unfamiliar charges: high-end restaurants, a spa day, designer clothing stores. The total added up to thousands of dollars, all charged to the emergency credit card he'd given Sarah to use only if she genuinely needed it. Leo's stomach dropped. He'd given her that card to make sure she always had a safety net in case of emergencies, not for shopping sprees or indulgent luxuries. He trusted her to use it responsibly, and now he was faced with the reality that she'd taken advantage of his trust. He decided to confront her about it, hoping there was some kind of explanation he hadn't thought of. When he brought it up, he tried to keep his tone calm. "Sarah, I noticed some unusual charges on the credit card I gave you. I thought it was for emergencies only, but there are thousands of dollars on there for things like clothes, restaurants, and spa treatments. Can you explain?" Sarah looked at him, her expression unapologetic. "Leo, you're overreacting. It's just a few things I needed. Besides, you're doing well financially. I didn't think it would be a big deal." Leo felt a wave of frustration and hurt wash over him. "Sarah, I gave you the card in case you were ever in a difficult situation, not for luxury spending. I trusted you to use it carefully." She shrugged, her tone dismissive. "Leo, it's not like you can't afford it. You act like a few $1,000s is going to break the bank. I thought we were building a life together. Isn't that part of what being in a relationship is about?" Her words struck a nerve. Leo had always believed that a relationship was built on trust, respect, and shared values. He hadn't imagined that being together meant blindly funding her lifestyle, or providing her with endless financial freedom. He looked at her feeling a mixture of disbelief and sadness. This wasn't the partnership he'd envisioned. "Sarah, this isn't about whether I can afford it," he replied, struggling to keep his voice steady. "It's about boundaries, about respecting the trust I placed in you. I never expected this from you. I thought you understood what that card was for." She rolled her eyes, crossing her arms defensively. "Leo, I don't see why you're making this such a big deal. I'm your fiancé. Isn't part of being in a relationship sharing what you have?" For Leo, her words felt like a betrayal. He'd wanted to share his life with her, yes, but he'd also hoped for a partner who respected his values and his hard work. The more he listened to her justifications, the more he felt that they saw money and trust in entirely different ways. After that conversation, Leo couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. He started to think about other instances where Sarah had blurred boundaries, small moments he'd overlooked. There was the time she'd asked for access to his personal bank account just in case, and the time she'd commented on how lucky he was to have built such a successful business. At the time he'd shrugged those comments off, but now they seemed to carry a different weight. He decided to take a closer look at their shared expenses, reviewing joint accounts and credit card statements. What he found left him stunned. There were additional charges he hadn't noticed before: more luxury items, extravagant dinners, expensive gifts she'd bought for herself. It was as if she saw his money as an endless resource, there for her to use as she pleased. Feeling betrayed and disheartened, Leo decided he couldn't ignore this any longer. He called his bank and canceled the emergency credit card. Then, he started the process of separating their joint accounts, wanting to put a clear boundary in place. He knew that if he didn't take action now, he'd be sending the message that this kind of behavior was acceptable, and that was something he couldn't allow. When Sarah realized what he'd done, she confronted him, her tone angry and accusatory. "Leo, why did you cancel the card? I can't believe you'd do that to me without even talking to me first." He looked at her, feeling a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "Sarah, I did talk to you. I told you why I gave you that card, and I told you how it made me feel to see those charges. But you brushed it off like my concerns didn't matter." She scoffed, folding her arms. "So what, now you're going to control everything? I thought we were a team, Leo. You're making me feel like some outsider, like I don't belong in your life." Leo took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Sarah, this isn't about controlling anything. It's about boundaries, respect, and trust. I thought we shared those values, but I'm starting to realize we don't see things the same way." Her expression shifted, but there was no apology, no sign of understanding. Instead, she looked at him with a sense of entitlement, as if his decision to set boundaries was some kind of personal offense. Leo felt a deep sadness settle over him, realizing that they'd reached a point where his values were no longer aligned with hers. This wasn't the partnership he'd dreamed of, it was something he could no longer pretend to ignore. That night, as he sat alone, Leo felt a painful clarity. He couldn't continue down this path with Sarah, not if it meant compromising his values and losing sight of who he was. He wanted a relationship built on mutual respect, not one where his hard work was treated as a convenience. At that moment he knew he had to make a choice. He couldn't keep hoping things would change, that somehow they'd find common ground. It was time to face the reality of their differences and accept that maybe, just maybe, this relationship wasn't meant to be. Escalating drama and apartment standoff. After Leo canceled Sarah's emergency credit card and began separating their joint accounts, he expected her to respect his decision, or at the very least acknowledge it. But instead, she took things in a direction he hadn't anticipated. Sarah's attitude shifted dramatically, and the tension between them became almost unbearable. One morning, as they sat at the kitchen table, Leo broached the topic he'd been avoiding. "Sarah, I think it's time we take a break from each other. I need some space to think, and maybe you do too. It might be best if we don't stay under the same roof right now." Sarah looked at him, her expression turning cold. "You want me to leave? Leo, I live here too. This is my home now, whether you like it or not." Leo felt a wave of frustration but kept his voice calm. "Sarah, I'm not saying you have to leave permanently. I just think some time apart would be good for both of us. We need to figure things out without all this constant tension." But Sarah wouldn't budge. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Leo, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not about to pack up my life because you suddenly feel uncomfortable. If you need space, then you can go." Leo felt his patience wearing thin. "This isn't about making anyone uncomfortable, Sarah. This is about respect. We're clearly not seeing eye to eye, and I need time to process everything that's happened." Sarah shook her head, her tone defiant. "Well, you can process it while I stay here. I have just as much right to this place as you do." Her refusal to consider his request added fuel to the frustration Leo was already feeling. He'd hoped that she would recognize his need for space as a way to cool things down, to give them both time to reflect. But instead she was digging in her heels, making it clear that she wasn't about to let go, even temporarily. In the days that followed, their interactions became more strained. Sarah continued living her life as if nothing had changed, and Leo felt like he was trapped in his own home. He tried to establish boundaries, but it was clear she had no intention of respecting them. She stayed out late, invited friends over without asking, and treated the apartment like it was solely hers. Every day, Leo felt his frustration building, and every day he grew more certain that this was not the life he wanted. Things came to a head one evening when Leo returned home to find that Sarah had thrown a small gathering with her friends, filling the apartment with laughter and loud music. He hadn't been consulted, and the disregard for his wishes felt like a slap in the face. When he asked her to keep things down, she dismissed him, saying he was too uptight and needed to relax. Unable to contain his anger, Leo pulled her aside, speaking in a low, controlled voice. "Sarah, I've tried to be respectful, but this is my home too. I've asked you for space, I've asked you to consider my feelings. But you keep ignoring everything I say." She looked at him, unbothered, and replied, "Leo, I told you I'm not going anywhere. If you have a problem with it, maybe you're the one who should leave." That was the breaking point for Leo. He realized that Sarah was no longer just ignoring his requests, she was challenging him, pushing back on every boundary he tried to set. She was refusing to acknowledge his needs, and it felt as though she was actively trying to assert control over his life. That night, Leo made the decision to take action. He knew he couldn't force her out immediately, but he also couldn't keep living in a constant state of tension and disrespect. He contacted a lawyer the next morning to discuss his options, hoping to find a way to resolve the situation peacefully. The lawyer advised him to give Sarah an official notice to move out, as they weren't legally married yet, and she technically didn't have the right to stay indefinitely. Feeling a sense of relief, Leo prepared the notice and gave it to Sarah, hoping she'd understand that this was necessary for them to move forward. But when she read the paper, her face turned red with anger. "You're kicking me out? Really, Leo? After everything we've been through?" Leo took a deep breath, keeping his tone calm. "Sarah, this isn't about punishment or revenge. I just need space, and I think you do too. We both know things aren't working, and it's only getting worse." But Sarah wasn't willing to hear him out. She began calling friends, venting about how heartless he was, and claiming he was leaving her with nowhere to go. Leo could hear snippets of her conversations, and each word stung. She painted herself as the victim, telling anyone who would listen that he was abandoning her. In reality, he just needed time to find clarity in a situation that felt increasingly chaotic. Then she began contacting his family again, sharing exaggerated stories about how he was forcing her out and leaving her on the streets. His phone started buzzing with messages from family members, asking why he was being so cruel and questioning his choices. Each message felt like a blow, making him feel even more isolated in a situation he tried to handle with care. One evening, Sarah confronted him directly, looking at him with a mixture of anger and defiance. "If you think you can just throw me out, think again. I'm not going anywhere until I'm ready to leave. And if you keep pushing me, I'll make sure everyone knows how heartless you really are." Leo felt his chest tighten. He'd never imagined that someone he loved could become so cold, so unwilling to consider his needs. He'd always believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, but now, he was seeing a side of Sarah he could no longer ignore. She was willing to manipulate, to use his family and friends against him, just to keep control of the situation. At that moment, Leo realized that this wasn't just about a difference in values or a disagreement. This was about someone who refused to respect him, someone who was willing to cross any line to get what she wanted. It was a painful realization, but it brought him a sense of clarity. He knew now that he couldn't build a future with someone who treated him this way. Leo spent the next few days preparing for the next steps, determined to protect himself and his peace. He reached out to his lawyer again, discussing the legalities of ending their arrangement and ensuring that Sarah would have to move out. He felt a mixture of sadness and relief, knowing that while this was the end of something he'd once cherished, it was also the beginning of reclaiming his life. Final attempt at reconciliation. A few days after the standoff over the apartment, Leo felt a lingering sadness and frustration. Despite everything, a part of him wanted to believe that this was just a misunderstanding, that there was some way they could still find common ground. He remembered the good moments they'd shared and wondered if those memories were worth one last attempt to salvage their relationship. He reached out to Sarah, suggesting they meet at a quiet cafe nearby. When she arrived, he noticed she looked different, more defensive, her expression closed off. But Leo pushed past his own reservations, hoping this final conversation might bring clarity. "Sarah," he began, his voice steady but calm, "I wanted to talk because, despite everything, I still care about you. I know we've been through a lot, and I don't want to end things with resentment. I just want to understand where you're coming from." Sarah crossed her arms, her expression guarded. "Leo, I don't get why you're making this so complicated. We were fine until you started putting up all these boundaries. It feels like you don't trust me at all." Leo took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "It's not that I don't trust you, Sarah. I felt blindsided by your changes to the prenup, and by how you handled the credit card. Those actions made me feel like we weren't on the same page about trust and respect." She looked away, a flash of irritation crossing her face. "Leo, I just wanted to make sure I was taken care of. I don't understand why that's so hard for you to accept. Isn't that what being in a partnership is about?" Leo felt a familiar sadness settling over him. He'd hoped that maybe, with enough time and space, she'd see things from his perspective. That she'd realize why he'd felt hurt. But her words only seemed to reinforce what he feared most, that they didn't share the same values when it came to trust and partnership. "Sarah, I don't mind sharing what I have," he replied, keeping his voice gentle. "Oh, I never have. But it's about being open with each other, about having the same respect for boundaries." When you changed the prenup without telling me, and spent money from the emergency card, without even considering how it would affect me. It made me feel like you didn't see me as a partner, you saw me as a provider. Her expression hardened. So, what, you think I'm using you? That I'm some kind of gold digger? Leo shook his head, feeling the weight of his words. It's not that simple. I know you care about me, but I feel like we have very different ideas of what this relationship means. For me, it's about respect and partnership. It's about building a life together with mutual trust. I don't want to feel like my work and my success is something to be claimed. I want to be valued for who I am, not just for what I have. She let out a small, bitter laugh. So all this is just about you protecting your precious company, your money. That's all this is to you, isn't it? Leo felt a pang of sadness. No, Sarah, it's about much more than that. It's about realizing that maybe we're not as compatible as we thought. I don't want to lose myself in a relationship where my values and boundaries aren't respected. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. So what do you want me to say, Leo? That I was wrong? That I should have handled things differently? Is that what you want? He paused, his heart heavy. I just wanted honesty. I wanted a real partnership, one where we respected each other enough to have open conversations, even when they were difficult. And right now I'm not sure we have that. There was a long, tense silence between them, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Finally Sarah spoke, her tone sharp and defensive. Well, I guess you're just not willing to share your life then. Maybe you're not ready for a real commitment. Her words cut deeper than he expected. But instead of reacting with anger, Leo felt a sense of acceptance wash over him. This was the clarity he'd needed, the realization that no matter how hard he tried, they simply couldn't see eye to eye. He looked at her, his voice calm but resolute. Maybe you're right, Sarah. Maybe we're both looking for something different in a relationship. And maybe, for both of us, this is the moment we need to move on. Sarah's expression softened slightly as if she hadn't expected him to agree. So, that's it, then? After everything? Leo nodded slowly, feeling a bittersweet mixture of relief and sorrow. Yeah, I think it is. I don't want to keep hurting each other or forcing something that doesn't feel right. I think it's time we go our separate ways. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a flicker of regret in her eyes, but it quickly disappeared. She looked down, then back up at him, her expression unreadable. Fine. If that's how you feel. They sat in silence for a moment longer, each lost in their own thoughts. Leo felt the weight of finality settling over him, but also a sense of peace. He'd given it his best and tried to find understanding, but it was clear they were on different paths. And while it hurt to let go, he knew it was the right thing to do. As they stood up to leave, Leo offered her a small, respectful nod. I wish you the best, Sarah. I hope you find what you're looking for. She nodded back, a brief, almost imperceptible softness in her gaze. You too, Leo. And with that, they went their separate ways, both knowing that while they had loved each other, love alone wasn't enough to bridge the gap between them. Leo left the cafe feeling a mixture of sadness and relief, knowing he'd made the right choice. He'd tried, he'd been honest. And now it was time to move forward, focusing on a future built on his values and dreams. Closure and moving forward. As Leo walked away from that final conversation with Sarah, he felt an unexpected sense of relief. The weight of their relationship, which had grown heavier with each clash of values, finally lifted. He felt a sadness, of course losing someone he had once loved deeply was painful. But there was a peace in knowing that he had stayed true to himself, even when it wasn't easy. In the days that followed, Leo spent a lot of time reflecting on the journey he'd just gone through. He thought about all the moments where he'd compromised, where he'd brushed aside his own feelings to keep the peace. And while those choices had come from a place of love, he now understood that they had come at a cost to his own sense of self. Leo also began to reconnect with family and friends, many of whom had been swayed by Sarah's version of events. At first, the conversations were difficult. Some of his loved ones still believed he had been too stingy or unwilling to compromise. But as he shared his side of the story, explaining the hurt and betrayal he'd felt when Sarah changed their agreement without telling him, they began to understand. His sister Emily, who had been one of Sarah's biggest supporters, listened quietly as he shared his experience. When he finished, she sighed, looking at him with a mixture of regret and understanding. I didn't realize how much you were dealing with, Leo. I thought you were just trying to protect your money. I didn't see that it was about more than that. Leo nodded, feeling a sense of closure as he spoke openly about his values and what he wanted in a relationship. It wasn't about the money, Em. It was about respect, about finding someone who values me for who I am, not just for what I can provide. I want a real partnership, and I don't think that's too much to ask. Emily reached out, giving his hand a reassuring squeeze. You're right, Leo. You deserve someone who sees you, not just what you have. I'm sorry if I made you feel like you were wrong for protecting yourself. With each conversation, Leo felt a small piece of himself returning, as if he were slowly reclaiming his life. The isolation he'd felt was replaced by a new sense of connection with the people who truly cared about him. As he shared his journey with them, he realized that this experience had taught him valuable lessons about boundaries, trust, and self-respect. Leo also poured his energy back into his work. His tech company, which had always been a source of pride and fulfillment, became a symbol of his resilience. He found renewed passion in his projects, spending long hours developing new ideas and collaborating with his team. It was comforting to focus on something he loved, something that he'd built from the ground up, and in those moments of creative flow, he felt truly himself. But Leo's life wasn't just about work. He took time to reconnect with friends he'd drifted from during his relationship with Sarah, and he found joy in simple things he'd once taken for granted. He went hiking, met friends for dinners, and even joined a weekend soccer league to stay active and meet new people. It was refreshing to have his own space, to make choices without feeling like he had to justify them to someone else. Through all of this, he couldn't help but feel grateful for the experience with Sarah, not because it had been easy, but because it had shown him what he truly needed in a relationship. He wanted someone who valued honesty, who respected his boundaries, and who shared his approach to life. And he was willing to wait for that, no matter how long it took. Over time, Leo began to look toward the future with a sense of hope. He knew he'd one day find someone who saw him for who he was and wanted to build a life based on trust and respect. But until then, he was content focusing on his own journey, on building a life that reflected his values and dreams. The experience with Sarah was a chapter in his life, one that had brought pain, but also wisdom. Leo had learned that protecting his boundaries didn't make him selfish or unloving, it made him honest and true to himself. And that, he realized, was the foundation of any real connection. As he sat in his apartment one evening, reflecting on everything he'd gone through, Leo felt a quiet strength within him. He didn't need anyone to complete him or to validate his choices. He was whole on his own, capable of creating a fulfilling life rooted in integrity and self-respect. And with that realization, he closed the door on the past, looking forward to whatever lay ahead.